The world was a silent film and Alara was its most beautiful fragile star. Alexander Vance watched his daughter from a polished teak bench, his heart a clenched fist in his chest. At 5 years old, Alara moved through the upscale playground with a ghost's grace, her small hands tracing the smooth metal of the slide without descending, her eyes following a ladybug's journey across the monkey bars. She hadn't made a sound, not a single one, since the car accident 2 years ago that had stolen her mother and her voice in one terrible screeching instant. The city's best specialists had called it selective mutism, a psychological cage built from trauma. Alexander, the CEO of a tech empire that spanned continents, a man who could command boardrooms with a whisper, was powerless to free her. Had built this entire playground, a private oasis on the grounds of their estate. For her it was a perfect, sterile, silent world, but today, on a rare impulse, had brought her to a public park, a place pulsing with the chaotic, noisy life he usually shielded her from. He thought, perhaps foolishly, that the sounds of other children might somehow beckon her own voice out of hiding. "It's okay, sweetheart," he murmured as she drifted near the swings, her wide hazel eyes taking in the scene. "Just watch." His phone buzzed incessantly in his pocket. A merger was collapsing in Tokyo, but he ignored it. For Alara, he could always ignore it. Near the sandbox, another scene of domestic life was unfolding. A man, rugged and dressed in faded jeans and a worn leather jacket, was pushing a little boy on a swing. The boy was shrieking with laughter, a raw, unfiltered sound that seemed to vibrate in the very air. "Higher, Papa, higher," the boy yelled. "Hold on tight, Leo," the man called back, his voice a warm, gravelly baritone that carried easily over the din. Alexander felt a pang of something sharp and ugly, envy. It was so simple for them, so effortless. He watched as the man, whose name was Ben, effortlessly caught his son as he jumped from the swing, spinning him around in a gale of giggles before setting him down. Leo immediately ran towards the climbing frame where Alara now stood, a silent statue observing the animated world. Ben's eyes met Alexander's. For a moment there was a quiet understanding in them, a flicker of empathy that Alexander, in his tailored suit and isolation, found irritating. He looked away. "Leo," a bundle of boundless energy, skidded to a halt in front of Alara. "Wanna play?" he asked, his words tumbling out in a single breathless stream. Alara took a small step back, her small fingers twisting together. She shook her head, a barely perceptible movement. "You don't talk?" Leo asked, tilting his head with a child's blunt curiosity. Alara just stared. Ben approached, placing a gentle hand on his son's shoulder. "Hey buddy, not everyone wants to talk, maybe she just likes to listen." He smiled down at Alara, a kind, unpretentious smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "It's nice to meet you. I am Ben. This is my son Leo." Alexander stood up, a protective instinct surging through him. "She's fine," he said, his voice tighter than he intended. "She doesn't speak." Ben nodded, unfazed. "That's okay, Leo here talks enough for 3 kids." He ruffled his son's hair. "Come on, let's go see if we can conquer the dragon slide." But as Ben turned to lead Leo away, something happened. Alara, who had been frozen, took a tentative step forward. Her eyes were locked not on the boisterous boy but on Ben. She reached out and tugged ever so gently on the fringe of his leather jacket. Both men froze. Alexander's breath hitched. It was more initiative than she had shown with a stranger in years. Ben crouched down, bringing himself to her eye level. "What is it, sweetheart?" Alara's lips parted. Nothing came out. A faint flush of frustration colored her pale cheeks. "It's okay," Ben said, his voice dropping into a soothing, confidential tone. He didn't look at her with pity or clinical curiosity, but with a simple, profound patience. "You know, my Leo, when he was really little he had a hard time finding his words too. Sometimes they get a little lost. We just have to wait for them to find their way home." He pointed to a nearby oak tree, its leaves just beginning to turn. "See that tree? I always think voices are like the leaves. They're in there all along. They just need the right season to come out." It was a simple, silly, beautiful metaphor, the kind a child's therapist would never use, the kind a father would. And then Ben began to hum. It was a low, familiar tune, the melody of "Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star." He hummed it softly, his eyes never leaving Alara's. He wasn't performing, he was just sharing a sound. Alexander watched, his CEO's heart a thing of spreadsheets and strategy feeling as though it were being cracked open. He saw his daughter's entire body go still, listening. Her eyes, usually so distant, were focused, drinking in the simple melody. Ben finished humming and gave her another soft smile. He started to rise. And that's when it happened. Alara's small hand darted out and caught his. Her mouth opened again. A tiny strained sound like a rusty hinge escaped. It was just air at first, then a whisper so faint it was almost carried away by the breeze. But in the perfect, agonizing silence that Alexander perpetually inhabited, it was a thunderclap. Again. The word was barely a syllable more, a ghost of a plea. Alexander froze, the world tilted on its axis, the chatter of the park, the buzz of his phone, the very beating of his own heart. Everything ceased to exist. There was only that one impossible word, that voice he had dreamed of, prayed for, mourned. Tears hot and shameless welled in his eyes, blurring his vision. He was a statue, a man turned to stone by a single whispered word. Ben, still crouched, looked as stunned as Alexander felt. His eyes widened and he slowly looked from Alara's hopeful upturned face to Alexander's shattered one. She spoke, Ben whispered, his own voice thick with emotion. Alexander could only nod, a single jerky motion. He was drowning in a tsunami of joy, disbelief, and a painful sharp-edged gratitude towards this stranger, this single dad in a leather jacket who in 2 minutes had done what a battalion of experts and 2 years of a father's desperate love had failed to do. The drive home was a blur of silent trembling. Alara buckled into her car seat, had retreated back into her silence, but it felt different now. It was no longer an impenetrable fortress but a quiet garden where a single miraculous seed had just sprouted. Alexander kept glancing at her in the rearview mirror, his eyes still wet, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. He replayed the moment in a loop, the tug on the jacket, Ben's gentle humming, the whispered, earth-shattering again. He was a man who solved problems, and now he had a new urgent one. Finding Ben, he had to thank him, he had to understand how had he done it. The man had to be a speech therapist, a child psychologist, something. He had a raw natural talent that Alexander needed to hire, to harness, to secure for his daughter. The next day, consumed by a frantic hopeful energy, Alexander used his resources. It was frighteningly easy. A description, the park's location, the name Leo, his assistant, had an address and a name. By lunchtime, Ben Carter. He lived in a modest apartment complex across town, no listed profession. Alexander decided to go himself. This wasn't a business deal, it was a pilgrimage. He stood outside Ben's door feeling uncharacteristically nervous. He smoothed his suit jacket, took a breath, and knocked. The door opened and Ben stood there wearing a paint-stained t-shirt, looking surprised. "Mr. Vance." "Alexander, please," he said, his voice earnest. I had to come to thank you properly." Ben stepped back, allowing him inside. The apartment was warm and lived in, scattered with toys and the smell of coffee. Leo was building a fortress with blocks in the living room. "What you did yesterday," Alexander began, the words catching in his throat. "My daughter, she hasn't spoken a word in 2 years, not one, and you reached her in 2 minutes." Ben gestured to a worn sofa. "I didn't do anything special, I just talked to her. That's the point. I've spent a fortune on the best people, none of them could do what you did." Alexander leaned forward, his intensity filling the small room. "What's your secret? Are you a therapist, a teacher?" A strange sad smile touched Ben's lips. He looked towards a framed photograph on the bookshelf. It showed a younger Ben, his arm around a woman with a vibrant laughing face and brilliant green eyes. The sight of her sent a jolt, vague and unsettling, through Alexander. "No," Ben said softly, his gaze distant. "I am a carpenter. I just understand what it's like to lose your voice, not literally, but to have the music in your life go silent." He looked directly at Alexander, his eyes now holding a depth of pain that mirrored Alexander's own. "My wife Clara, she was a music teacher. Her voice, it was the most beautiful sound I'd ever known. She could make a whole room fall silent just by singing a lullaby." Alexander's breath stilled. "Clara," the name echoed in the quiet room, a key turning in a lock he never knew existed. "There was a car accident," Ben continued, his voice a low rough scrape. "2 years ago, a driver high on his own power and a few too many martinis at a business lunch ran a red light." He paused, the memory of physical weight on him. "He walked away without a scratch. My Clara, she was gone by the time the paramedics arrived. The air was sucked from the room." The date, the description. Alexander's world, which had just begun to right itself, tilted violently again. His blood ran cold. 2 years ago, business lunch, martini. A cold sweat broke out on his brow. He remembered that lunch, the celebration of a major acquisition, the blur of drinks, the frantic panicked phone call from his nanny about his wife and daughter being late, the drive to the intersection, the flashing lights, the twisted metal. He had been the other driver. He had been the one shrouded in airbags and legal impunity, his wealth and high-priced lawyers constructing a fortress around him, obscuring the full truth from the public, and in his own grief and guilt from himself he had buried the other victim's name, her face, the details of the life he had shattered deep in the darkest recesses of his mind, a survival mechanism. And now her husband was sitting 3 feet away from him, the man whose life he had obliterated, the man who had with incomprehensible grace just given him back his own. "The song I was humming for your little girl," Ben said, his eyes glistening as he looked back at the photograph. It was Clara's favorite, the one she sang to her students, to the baby she was carrying. The final piece of the horrifying puzzle slammed into place. Alara wasn't just responding to a kind stranger, she was responding to the ghost of a melody her mother Isabella must have loved and played for her, a melody that connected her to the woman in the other car. The two families, obliterated by one mom's reckless moment, were forever tragically intertwined. Alexander felt the walls of the cozy apartment closing in on him. The truth was a physical blow, a nausea-inducing poison. This man who had every right to hate him, to destroy him, had instead given him the greatest gift of his life, and Alexander had taken everything from him, his wife, the mother of his unborn unborn child, his future. He opened his mouth but no sound came out. The confession, the apology, the plea for forgiveness, they were ashes in his mouth. How could he speak? How could he shatter this man a second time by revealing the monstrous truth of his identity? He looked at Ben, truly looked at him. He saw the strength in his shoulders that carried the weight of his loss, the kindness in his eyes that had persisted through unimaginable pain, and he knew with a certainty that broke him that he could not speak. To tell the truth now would be an act of unspeakable cruelty, a second collision that would only cause more wreckage. He stood up on unsteady legs. I have to go, he choked out. Ben looked puzzled but nodded. I hope your little girl finds her voice again, Alexander, for good. The words were a dagger twisted with a mercy Alexander knew he did not deserve. He stumbled out of the apartment and into the sterile hallway, leaning against the wall as sobs he could not suppress racked his body. He had found the key to his daughter's silence only to discover it unlocked a door to his own personal hell. He had gotten his miracle, and it was built upon a foundation of his own unforgivable sin. The heartbreaking irony was complete. He had his daughter's voice back, but he would forever be mute, sentenced to a life of silent, grateful, agonizing penance, forever in the debt of the man whose world he had destroyed.